Imagine holding in your hands the only copy of a book that could cure cancer, or prevent the next pandemic, or solve climate change. Now imagine dropping it into a fire. That's essentially what happened when the Library of Alexandria was lost. Except it wasn't one book, it was hundreds of thousands of them. The complete works of Aristotle, lost plays by Sophocles and Euripides, scientific treatises that wouldn't be rediscovered for over 1,000 years. For nearly 600 years, this single institution preserved and expanded humanity's collective knowledge. It was the Google of the ancient world, Wikipedia and the Library of Congress combined. And then, it was gone. But here's what's remarkable, and what most people get wrong. The Library of Alexandria didn't die in a single catastrophic fire. The real story is far more complex, more tragic, and more relevant to our world today than you might think. Because in an age where entire digital libraries can be erased with a keystroke, where misinformation spreads faster than truth, where book bans are making headlines, the loss of Alexandria isn't ancient history. It's a warning. Our story begins in 332 BCE, when a 24-year-old king stood on this Egyptian coastline and imagined something that had never existed before. Alexander the Great had just conquered Egypt, and unlike other conquerors who simply exploited their new territories, Alexander wanted to build. Not just another city, but a bridge between civilizations, Greek and Egyptian, East and West, a beacon that would unite the known world through knowledge and culture. He personally laid out the city's grid, positioning it perfectly to catch cooling Mediterranean breezes. But Alexander died just 9 years later, at 32, never seeing his city completed. That task fell to his general and childhood friend, Ptolemy. Ptolemy the First Soter, the savior, claimed Egypt as his prize when Alexander's empire fragmented. But Ptolemy was more than just a military commander. He was one of the few generals who had studied alongside Alexander under Aristotle himself. He understood something crucial. Empires built on swords alone don't last, but empires built on knowledge. By 300 BCE, Alexandria had become the jewel of the Mediterranean. Over 500,000 people called it home: Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Phoenicians, Persians, Indians. It was the first truly cosmopolitan city, where dozens of languages echoed through the streets and ideas from a dozen civilizations collided and combined. The city boasted wide boulevards lined with columns, parks and gardens, temples to Greek and Egyptian gods side by side, public baths, theaters, and towering over the harbor, the lighthouse of Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, visible from 30 miles at sea. But Alexandria's greatest wonder wasn't made of stone. It was made of papyrus and knowledge. Welcome to the Museum and Library of Alexandria. The museum, or Mausion in Greek, literally Shrine of the Muses, was revolutionary. It wasn't a museum as we understand it today. It was the world's first true research institution, modeled on Aristotle's Lyceum in Athens, but vastly more ambitious. Imagine combining Harvard, the Smithsonian, CERN, and Google into a single institution, all funded by the richest kingdom in the ancient world, with one mandate: pursue knowledge for its own sake. The museum employed the greatest minds of the age: mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, poets, philosophers, engineers, all living and working together, all expenses paid by the Ptolemaic dynasty. No teaching duties, no religious obligations, just one job: expand human knowledge. And at the heart of the museum stood its crown jewel, the Royal Library of Alexandria. The ancient sources describe a building of breathtaking scale: long colonnaded halls lined with shelves, reading rooms with comfortable seating, storage chambers extending deep into the building. Some accounts mention 10 rooms, others describe entire wings. The exact layout is lost to us, but one thing is certain. This was far more than just a book repository. This was humanity's first systematic attempt to collect and preserve all knowledge, not just Greek knowledge, all knowledge. Every scroll from every culture on every subject, medicine and mathematics, philosophy and poetry, history and astronomy, engineering and agriculture. If it had been written down anywhere in the known world, the library wanted a copy. The Ptolemies pursued this mission with an obsession that bordered on fanatical, and they had the wealth and power to make it happen. Ancient sources record that the Ptolemies instituted an extraordinary policy. Every ship that sailed into Alexandria's harbor was searched, not for contraband or weapons, for books. Any scroll found was confiscated and taken to the library. Highly skilled scribes would copy the text as quickly and accurately as possible. Then came the twist. The library kept the original and returned the copy to the ship's owner, along with compensation for the inconvenience. The scrolls acquired this way were cataloged as from the ships, but the most audacious acquisition came under Ptolemy III Euergetes, around 246 BCE. Athens possessed the original official copies of the great dramatic tragedies, the complete works of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These priceless manuscripts were kept in the state archives and never loaned out under any circumstances. Ptolemy requested to borrow them, offering 15 talents of silver as a security deposit, a fortune worth millions in modern currency. The Athenians, convinced that no one would forfeit such a sum, reluctantly agreed. The moment the scrolls arrived in Alexandria, Ptolemy had his best scribes make meticulous copies. Then he sent the copies back to Athens and kept the originals. He forfeited the 15 talents without a second thought. Better to lose silver than the wisdom of the ancients. The library's agents traveled to book markets in Rhodes and Athens, paying premium prices for rare works. They purchased entire private libraries from deceased scholars' estates. They commissioned translations of foreign texts, Egyptian hieroglyphic writings, Babylonian astronomical records, Hebrew scriptures, Phoenician histories, even Buddhist texts from India. According to legend, Ptolemy II commissioned 72 Jewish scholars to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek. Working in pairs on the island of Pharos, they produced the Septuagint, one of the most influential translations in history. For the first time, the wisdom of one culture was being systematically made accessible to another. What happened when you gathered the greatest minds in the world, gave them unlimited resources, and told them simply to think? You got the most productive period of scientific and literary achievement in ancient history. Between 300 and 100 BCE, the scholars of Alexandria made discoveries that wouldn't be matched for over 1,000 years. Some of these achievements sound like science fiction. Eratosthenes of Cyrene, the third head librarian, didn't just theorize that the earth was round. The educated Greeks already knew that. He decided to measure it. Using nothing but shadows, wells, and geometry, Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference around 240 BCE. His figure, 46,250 kilometers. The actual circumference, 40,075 kilometers at the equator. He was off by less than 2%. With shadows and mathematics, 2,250 years ago, Eratosthenes created the first map with latitude and longitude lines. He calculated the tilt of Earth's axis. He estimated the distance to the sun and moon with remarkable accuracy. And he still found time to write poetry, literary criticism, and catalog the library's holdings. Archimedes of Syracuse, though based in Sicily, studied in Alexandria and maintained connections throughout his life. His work in Alexandria laid foundations for physics, engineering, and mathematics that remain fundamental today. He discovered the principle of buoyancy, supposedly while taking a bath and noticing how water level changed. He developed the compound pulley and the hydraulic screw. He calculated pi with unprecedented precision. He discovered how to find the volume of irregular shapes. During the Roman siege of Syracuse in 212 BCE, Archimedes' war machines were so effective that Roman soldiers reportedly fled in terror when they saw a rope or beam appearing over the city walls. It took the Romans 3 years to capture the city, and when they did, a soldier killed the 75-year-old mathematician despite orders to take him alive. Herophilus of Chalcedon revolutionized medicine by doing something that was forbidden in most of the ancient world: systematically dissecting human cadavers. Working in Alexandria around 300 BCE, where the Ptolemies gave special permission for such studies, Herophilus distinguished between veins and arteries for the first time. He discovered that arteries carry blood, not air, as Aristotle had taught. He described the brain's ventricles. He identified the optic nerve and traced the nervous system. He was the first to recognize the brain, not the heart, as the seat of intelligence. He studied the liver, spleen, and reproductive organs with unprecedented detail. He even invented the first timing device for measuring pulse rates: a portable water clock. Ctesibius of Alexandria invented the first accurate water clock around 270 BCE. But he didn't stop there. He created the hydraulis, the world's first keyboard instrument powered by water pressure. He developed advanced pneumatic devices, including the first force pump. His successor, Hero of Alexandria, took mechanical invention to new heights. He created the aeolipile, a steam-powered sphere that spun when heated. While treated as a curiosity, it was essentially the first steam engine 17 centuries before the Industrial Revolution. Hero designed automatic temple doors that opened when a fire was lit on the altar. He created the first vending machine. Drop a coin in a slot, receive a measured amount of holy water. He wrote extensively on mathematics, optics, mechanics, and pneumatics. And then there was Euclid. Around 300 BCE, this mathematician compiled and systematized the entire body of Greek mathematical knowledge into a series of books called The Elements. The Elements wasn't just a math textbook, it was a revolution in logical thinking. Euclid established the axiomatic method, starting with self-evident truths and logically deriving everything else. This approach became the foundation not just for mathematics, but for all rigorous scientific thinking. Euclid's Elements remained the standard geometry textbook for over 2,000 years, used in schools until the 20th century. Only the Bible has been published in more editions. But the library wasn't just about science. It revolutionized how we think about literature itself. The first head librarian, Zenodotus of Ephesus, faced an enormous problem. The library now had multiple copies of famous works, Homer's epics, the Greek tragedies, but no two copies were exactly alike. Centuries of hand copying had introduced errors, variations, and interpolations. So Zenodotus invented textual criticism, the systematic comparison of manuscripts to establish authoritative texts. He was the first to divide Homer's works into 24 books each. He created critical editions with notes explaining his editorial choices. The second librarian, Callimachus, took organization to new levels. He created the Pinnaces, a 120-volume catalog of everything in the library, organized by author and subject. This wasn't just a card catalog, it was the first comprehensive bibliography in history, the first systematic literary history, and essentially the foundation for how libraries are organized today. Every time you search a library database, you're using a system that traces back to Callimachus of Cyrene, Aristarchus of Samothrace, head librarian in the 2nd century BCE, took literary scholarship even further. He invented critical symbols, marks in manuscripts indicating disputed passages, suggested corrections, or questionable authenticity. Those little marks academics still use, asterisks, daggers, brackets. Many were invented in Alexandria. Aristarchus also systematized Greek grammar and accents, establishing rules that define classical Greek to this day. But perhaps the library's greatest achievement was cultural translation. For the first time in history, knowledge from different civilizations was systematically brought together, compared, and synthesized. Greek scholars learned from Egyptian astronomy and medicine. Jewish philosophy influenced Greek thought. Babylonian mathematics was preserved and expanded. Indian concepts began percolating westward. The cross-pollination of ideas was unprecedented, and as scholars trained in Alexandria fanned out across the Mediterranean world, they carried this knowledge with them, creating a network of learning that spanned continents. The library's golden age began to tarnish in 145 BCE, when Ptolemy VIII Physcon, Fatty, took power after years of civil war. Paranoid and vengeful, he purged Alexandria's intellectual elite. The head librarian, Aristarchus, resigned and fled to Cyprus in exile. Dozens of the museum's scholars followed. These weren't random victims. They represented centuries of accumulated expertise, master teachers, specialists in fields that might take decades to master. The scholars scattered, establishing schools throughout the Greek world. Alexandria's loss became the Mediterranean's gain, but the concentration of genius that had made the library so productive was broken forever. The library continued to function, but its prestige had been damaged. The Ptolemaic dynasty itself was declining, beset by internal conflicts and external pressure from a rising power, Rome. In 48 BCE, Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria pursuing his rival Pompey in the Roman Civil War. He found himself caught in another civil war between Cleopatra and her brother husband Ptolemy XIII, who both claimed Egypt's throne. Caesar, brilliant general that he was, quickly assessed his tactical situation. He was surrounded, outnumbered, and about to be trapped. His only escape route was the harbor, but Ptolemy's fleet blocked it. Caesar's solution was ruthless and effective. He ordered his men to set fire to the Egyptian ships docked in the harbor. The flames spread exactly as planned, destroying Ptolemy's fleet and clearing the way for Roman vessels. But fire in ancient cities was notoriously difficult to control. The flames spread from the ships to the wooden wharves, then to waterfront warehouses, then to nearby buildings. One ancient source, the Roman writer Seneca, quoting an earlier historian named Livy, claims that 40,000 scrolls stored in waterfront warehouses were destroyed that night. Were these scrolls part of the library's collection? Were they being held for processing? Were they duplicates for export, or were they simply commercial cargo? Here's what's crucial. The main library building was located in the Bruchion quarter, near the royal palaces, not on the waterfront. The fire damaged the harbor district, but ancient sources make no mention of the library itself burning. Interestingly, Caesar wrote extensively about his campaign in Alexandria, but he never mentions destroying the library. For a man who meticulously documented his victories, this silence is telling. If he had destroyed the world's greatest library, his enemies would have used it as propaganda, yet there's no record of such accusations. The geographer Strabo visited Alexandria around 20 BCE, describing a functioning museum and indicating that scholars still had access to research materials. The prolific scholar Didymus Calcenterus produced thousands of commentaries during this period, clear evidence that extensive library resources remained available. So what actually happened in 48 BCE? Best evidence suggests that some portion of the library's holdings, possibly stored in harbor warehouses for transport or sale, were destroyed. But the main institution survived, damaged, reduced, but not destroyed. Still, Caesar's fire marked a turning point. It demonstrated the library's vulnerability. It destroyed some irreplaceable texts, and it foreshadowed more devastating losses to come. What many people don't realize is that there wasn't just one Library of Alexandria. There were at least two. The Temple of Serapis, or Serapeum, housed what became known as the Daughter Library, a collection that some ancient sources suggest held around 10% of the main library's total holdings, possibly 40,000 scrolls. While smaller than the Royal Library, the Serapeum was substantial in its own right. It served public scholars while the Royal Library remained more exclusive. It focused particularly on Egyptian religious texts and the growing field of Neoplatonic philosophy. But by the 4th century CE, a new force was reshaping the Mediterranean world: Christianity. In 313 CE, Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity. By 380 CE, Christianity became the Roman Empire's official religion. Pagan temples found themselves under increasing pressure. In this turbulent world stood one of history's most remarkable figures, Hypatia of Alexandria, daughter of Theon, the last known member of the museum. Born around 350 or 370 CE, Hypatia was a Neoplatonist philosopher, mathematician, and astronomer. She wrote commentaries on Ptolemy's Almagest and Apollonius's work on conic sections. She collaborated with her father on a commentary of Euclid's Elements, the version that remained the standard Greek text until the 19th century. But Hypatia was more than a scholar, locked in an ivory tower. She taught publicly, lectured on Plato and Aristotle in the city's streets, advised government officials, and attracted students from across the Mediterranean world. Her influence crossed religious boundaries. Synesius of Cyrene, one of her most devoted students, became a Christian bishop but maintained his correspondence with his pagan teacher, valuing her philosophical insight. But in 415 CE, Alexandria was a powder keg. The new bishop, Cyril, was locked in a power struggle with the Roman prefect Orestes. The city had become violently divided between Christians, Jews, and the remaining pagans, and Hypatia, brilliant and influential, found herself in the crossfire. According to the contemporary historian Socrates Scholasticus, Hypatia was respected by pagans and Christians alike. But rumors spread that she was preventing Orestes from reconciling with Bishop Cyril, that her pagan philosophy was leading Christians astray. In March 415 CE, a mob of Christian fanatics led by a church reader named Peter dragged Hypatia from her chariot. What followed was one of the most brutal murders in ancient history. They stripped her naked and dragged her to a church. There, according to ancient accounts, they beat her to death with roof tiles or pottery shards, tore her body apart, and burned the pieces outside the city walls. No one was ever punished for Hypatia's murder. Socrates Scholasticus, himself a Christian, wrote that surely nothing could be farther from the spirit of Christianity than such massacres. Hypatia's death sent shockwaves through the intellectual community. Many scholars fled Alexandria, carrying what books they could. The tradition of rational philosophical inquiry that had flourished for 7 centuries faced an increasingly hostile environment. Actually, let's back up 24 years, because the beginning of the end came earlier than Hypatia's murder. In 391 CE, Emperor Theodosius I issued a decree ordering the destruction of all pagan temples throughout the Roman Empire. For the Serapeum, with its priceless collection of scrolls and its centuries of learning, this was a death sentence. Bishop Theophilus, uncle of the later Bishop Cyril, led an attack on the Serapeum. Contemporary accounts describe him personally striking the first blow against the statue of Serapis. What followed was devastation. Multiple contemporary sources describe the destruction as thorough and violent. The philosopher Eunapius later wrote that the temple was destroyed to its foundations. What happened to the daughter library's scrolls? This is one of history's tragic mysteries. Some scholars undoubtedly managed to save texts, smuggling them to safety. Some scrolls may have been relocated to Christian libraries. But the bulk of the collection? Contemporary witness Aphthonius had described rooms in the Serapeum, which served as bookstores and were open to those who devoted their life to the cause of learning. After 391, those rooms stood empty. On the ruins of the Serapeum, Theophilus built a church. The transformation was complete. Alexandria's second great library was gone. Here's where we need to address the most persistent myth about the Library of Alexandria, that it was destroyed by Muslim conquerors in 641 CE. The story goes like this. When the Arab general Amr ibn al-As conquered Alexandria, he asked Caliph Umar what to do with the great library. The caliph supposedly replied, "If the books agree with the Quran, they are unnecessary. If they disagree, they are heretical. Therefore, destroy them." The scrolls, the story continues, were distributed to Alexandria's public baths as fuel for the furnaces. There were so many books that they burned for 6 months. There's just one problem. This entire story first appears in a text written in 1203 CE, over 500 years after the supposed event. The author? A Christian bishop named Gregory Bar Hebraeus, writing propaganda against Muslim rule. No contemporary sources mention the library during the Muslim conquest. Not Arab historians writing decades after the event. Not Christian chroniclers describing the fall of Alexandria. Not Byzantine accounts lamenting the loss of the city. The silence is deafening. Why? Because by 641 CE, there was almost certainly no library left to destroy. The main royal library had been declining for centuries. The daughter library at the Serapeum had been destroyed in 391, 250 years earlier. Modern historians, including scholars of Islamic history, have thoroughly debunked this myth. The famous story of Caliph Umar burning the library is a medieval fabrication, invented centuries after the fact to demonize Muslim rule. The bitter irony is that Islamic scholars were actually crucial to preserving ancient knowledge. From the 8th century onward, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad and other Islamic institutions translated and preserved countless Greek scientific and philosophical works. Without Muslim scholars, we would have lost even more of ancient learning. So if there was no single catastrophic destruction, what actually happened to the Library of Alexandria? The truth is more complex and in some ways more tragic. The library died slowly from 1,000 cuts over 6 centuries. Think of it less like a building burning down and more like a great institution declining into irrelevance through funding cuts, brain drain, and cultural change. First came the purges under Ptolemy VIII in 145 BCE. The diaspora of scholars wasn't just a temporary setback. It permanently dispersed Alexandrian learning throughout the Mediterranean. The concentration of genius that made the library special was broken. Then Caesar's fire in 48 BCE destroyed an unknown but significant portion of the collection. Even if the main building survived, the loss of even 40,000 scrolls represented decades or centuries of accumulated knowledge. Under Roman rule, patronage became irregular. Emperor Claudius and Hadrian supported the library in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, but most emperors ignored it. Without royal funding, the institution couldn't maintain its collections or attract top scholars. Military conflicts repeatedly damaged Alexandria. In 272 CE, when Emperor Aurelian retook the city from Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, the library's district was destroyed. Whether the building survived is unknown, but the institution was certainly crippled. In 365 CE, a massive earthquake and tsunami devastated the entire eastern Mediterranean. Alexandria suffered catastrophic damage. The famous Pharos lighthouse was damaged. Entire quarters of the city were destroyed. The library, if it still existed, as a functioning institution, would have been severely impacted. But perhaps the deadliest factor was cultural shift. As Christianity became dominant, pagan learning became suspect. Philosophy was heresy. Scientific inquiry challenged religious doctrine. The intellectual freedom that made Alexandria great was suffocating under religious orthodoxy. The destruction of the Serapeum in 391 CE likely marked the end of Alexandria as a major center of learning. After that, what remained was fragments, private collections, scattered scholars, institutional memories. Hypatia's murder in 415 CE became symbolic of this transition. The world's last great pagan philosopher, murdered by religious fanatics, her death unpunished. The message was clear. The age of free inquiry was over. Most historians believe that by the time of the Muslim conquest in 641 CE, the Library of Alexandria existed only as a memory. The institution had been dead for centuries. The building, if any trace remained, would have been a ruin or repurposed for other uses. So what exactly did we lose? Quantifying the destruction is almost impossible, but let's try. Ancient sources give wildly varying figures for the library's collection. Some claim 400,000 scrolls. Others say 700,000 or even more. Part of the discrepancy comes from counting methods. Were multiple works on a single scroll counted separately? Did they count duplicates? A typical papyrus scroll held roughly one book of an epic poem, about 15,000 words. The library's collection, even at a conservative estimate of 400,000 scrolls, would have contained roughly 6 billion words of text. Modern scholars have calculated that all surviving ancient Greek literature from before the 4th century BCE amounts to about 2 million words. Everything we have from the classical period, Homer, the playwrights, the historians, the philosophers, would require only about 250 scrolls. That means that possibly as little as one word in 3,000 has survived from the ancient Greek world. 1 in 3,000. The rest is gone forever. Let's talk specifics. What actual works were lost? Sophocles wrote 123 plays. We have 7 complete versions. The other 116 are lost, known only from fragments and references. Euripides wrote 92 plays, 18 survive. The rest are gone, including plays ancient critics considered his finest work. Aeschylus wrote 90 plays. 7 remain. We're missing 83 plays from the father of tragedy. Sappho of Lesbos was considered one of the greatest lyric poets in history. Ancient sources mention 9 volumes of her work. We have 1 complete poem and a collection of fragments. Everything else is lost. Aristotle wrote extensively for public audiences, polished dialogues and treatises that ancient sources praised as eloquent and beautiful. Those works are lost. What we have are his lecture notes and research documents, valuable but never meant for publication. The scientific losses may be even more devastating. We know the names of hundreds of ancient mathematicians, astronomers, physicians, and engineers whose works have vanished completely. Eratosthenes wrote a 3-volume work on geography that was the standard reference for centuries. Lost. His writings on chronology established the dating system used throughout antiquity. Lost. His mathematical treatises, lost. We know about them only from references in other works. Remember those books of Aristotle that Ptolemy II purchased for the library? Those weren't just copies. They were quite possibly Aristotle's original manuscripts, including works we've never seen. Gone. The library housed detailed maps of the known world, Africa's coast, the Indian Ocean, Central Asia. That geographic knowledge took Europeans another 1,400 years to reacquire. Texts in languages and scripts now indecipherable. Entire bodies of Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, Phoenician, and Indian knowledge translated into Greek. The translations lost, the originals often lost as well. But beyond the lost texts lies a more profound tragedy: lost potential. After Alexandria's decline, Western Europe entered what we call the Dark Ages. For roughly 1,000 years, scientific progress largely stagnated in the West. Medicine regressed. Engineering knowledge was lost. Literacy plummeted. In some fields, it took European civilization over 1,000 years to regain the level of knowledge that Alexandrian scholars had achieved. Herophilus's understanding of human anatomy wasn't matched until the Renaissance. Hero's mechanical devices weren't replicated until the Industrial Revolution. How many lives could have been saved if medieval physicians had access to the medical knowledge compiled in Alexandria? How many plagues might have been prevented with Alexandrian understanding of disease and hygiene? Hero of Alexandria created a steam engine in the 1st century CE, treated as a curiosity. The Industrial Revolution didn't begin until 1,700 years later. What if his work had been preserved and developed? How different might human history have been? Much of what we did recover came through an unlikely route: Islamic scholars. During Europe's Dark Ages, scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, and other Islamic centers translated and preserved ancient Greek texts. When these works finally reached medieval Europe, often through Arabic translations, they sparked the Renaissance. Think about that journey. Greek texts survived in Arabic translations, which were translated into Latin, which were translated into modern languages. Each translation introduced errors, corruptions, gaps. Many texts didn't survive even this torturous route. Yet, despite its destruction, the Library of Alexandria's legacy shapes our world today in ways you might not expect. Every library classification system traces its ancestry to Callimachus's Pinakes. The concept of the research university, scholars supported to pursue knowledge for its own sake, began at the Museum of Alexandria. Textual criticism, peer review, the citation of sources. These fundamental scholarly practices were pioneered in Alexandria. The critical symbols academics used to mark disputed text, invented in Alexandria. The very idea that human knowledge should be collected, organized, and made accessible to all, this revolutionary concept began with Ptolemy's dream of a universal library. The museum wasn't just a library, it was the first think tank, the first institute for advanced study. Organizations like the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, or CERN in Switzerland, or any major research university directly descend from the Museum of Alexandria's model. In 2002, after years of planning and construction, a new library opened in Alexandria. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina was built near the site of the ancient library, a UNESCO-backed project to revive Alexandria's legacy as a center of learning. It's not a recreation, it's a thoroughly modern library with capacity for 8 million books, digital archives, museums, and research centers. The new library focuses on preserving cultural heritage, digitizing at-risk texts, and promoting dialogue between cultures, continuing Alexandria's ancient mission in the 21st century. Its architecture is symbolic, a disk tilted toward the Mediterranean like the sun rising over the sea. The outer walls are inscribed with letters, characters, and symbols from every known human writing system, a monument to all human knowledge. But here's why the loss of the Library of Alexandria should terrify us. It could happen again. It is happening again. We live in an age of unprecedented information abundance. The entirety of human knowledge seems to be just a Google search away, but it's also more fragile than ever. Digital storage seems permanent, but is actually incredibly fragile. File formats become obsolete. Storage media degrades. Websites vanish. Companies go bankrupt, taking their data with them. Entire archives can be deleted in seconds, deliberately or accidentally. The Internet Archive's Wayback Machine preserves billions of web pages, but it's constantly under attack from hackers, threatened by copyright lawsuits, and running on a non-profit's budget. If it disappeared tomorrow, huge swaths of internet history would vanish. Modern scientific research is often locked behind paywalls, inaccessible to most of humanity. Studies become unreproducible when data isn't shared. Knowledge is being created but not properly preserved or distributed. Physical libraries face funding cuts worldwide. Books are being banned from libraries and curricula. Works are being removed from digital platforms. The same forces that destroyed Alexandria, religious extremism, political censorship, economic neglect, cultural conflict, still threaten knowledge today. Climate change poses physical threats to repositories of knowledge worldwide. Rising sea levels threaten coastal archives. Extreme weather endangers physical collections. How many irreplaceable manuscripts have been lost to flooding, fire, or conflict in just the past decade? And sometimes the destruction is deliberate. In 2015, ISIS militants destroyed the ancient city of Palmyra in Syria and burned thousands of manuscripts in Mosul's library. The Taliban destroyed the Bamiyan Buddhas. Wars in Iraq and Syria have devastated countless archaeological sites and museums. In 2018, Brazil's National Museum burned to the ground, destroying 20 million artifacts and specimens, including irreplaceable indigenous artifacts and the oldest human remains found in the Americas. The cause? Years of funding cuts and neglect leading to inadequate fire safety systems. In 2021, a wildfire swept through the University of Cape Town, destroying large portions of the Jagger Library, including rare African manuscripts and collections. In 2009, Amazon remotely deleted copies of George Orwell's 1984 from customers' Kindles due to a licensing dispute. The irony was lost on no one. If a company can delete purchased books from your device, do you really own them? We're developing new technologies to preserve knowledge. DNA data storage, quantum computing, distributed blockchain archives. But each innovation brings new vulnerabilities. A major solar flare or electromagnetic pulse could wipe out electronic storage across entire regions. Our interconnected digital infrastructure creates single points of failure. A sufficiently sophisticated cyber attack could erase vast amounts of data simultaneously. Organizations like the Long Now Foundation are thinking about long-term knowledge preservation. Their Rosetta project created a disk with information about over 1,500 human languages, designed to last thousands of years. The Global Seed Vault in Svalbard preserves crop diversity. The Internet Archive creates digital backups. The lesson from Alexandria is clear. Redundancy is crucial. Knowledge must be duplicated, distributed geographically, stored in multiple formats. No single institution, no single location, no single medium should hold the only copy of anything important. So what do we do with the tragedy of Alexandria? How do we honor what was lost? First, we must continue preserving what remains. Every ancient text that survives should be digitized, translated, made freely accessible. Every endangered language should be documented. Every culture's knowledge should be recorded before it vanishes. Second, we must democratize access to knowledge. The Library of Alexandria was elite, accessible mainly to sponsored scholars. We have the technology to do better, to make all human knowledge freely available to anyone with an internet connection. The open access movement, Creative Commons licenses, public domain digitization projects, these are the spiritual successors to Alexandria's dream. Wikipedia alone contains more information than the Library of Alexandria ever held, and it's free to anyone in the world. Third, we must recapture Alexandria's spirit of cross-cultural, interdisciplinary learning. The museum brought together scholars from different civilizations, different fields, different traditions. Today, academic specialization often creates silos. The greatest breakthroughs come when we connect ideas across boundaries. Fourth, we must teach not just knowledge, but wisdom. How to think critically, how to evaluate sources, how to distinguish truth from propaganda. In an age of information overload and viral misinformation, these skills are survival tools. And finally, we must support the institutions that preserve and share knowledge. Libraries need funding, archives need resources, museums need maintenance, teachers need support. These aren't luxuries, they're the immune system of civilization. The Library of Alexandria taught us that knowledge is fragile, that civilization's memory can be erased, that centuries of accumulated wisdom can vanish within a generation, but it also taught us something else. Knowledge wants to survive. Despite everything, fire, war, religious persecution, neglect, time itself, fragments of Alexandria's wisdom endured. Scholars risked their lives to save texts. Copies were hidden. Ideas were remembered and passed down. The human drive to learn, to understand, to preserve and share knowledge. This impulse is stronger than the forces that would destroy it, but only if we actively choose to protect what we know. Every teacher sharing knowledge is rebuilding Alexandria. Every archivist preserving records is fighting against the darkness. Every researcher publishing findings is lighting a candle. Every Wikipedia editor documenting the world is continuing the work that Callimachus began 2,300 years ago. The Library of Alexandria is gone. We cannot bring it back. We cannot recover what was lost, but we can learn from its destruction. We can build better, store smarter, share more freely, think longer term, act with the understanding that what we create today might be all that survives of our civilization in 1,000 years. The real Library of Alexandria isn't a building that burned. It's an idea that refuses to die. The idea that all human knowledge should be gathered, preserved, and shared with everyone. That library still exists. It exists in every institution that preserves knowledge, in every person who teaches, in every mind that learns. In every moment, someone chooses curiosity over ignorance, understanding over prejudice, wisdom over fear. We are all the Library of Alexandria now. The question is, what will we choose to preserve?